All right, thanks everybody. Since it's my understanding there's a reasonable chance that this will wind up on YouTube, I'm going to forego my usual banter because YouTube viewers are notoriously impatient. If you're not into that subject matter within the first 15 seconds, that's it, they're switching. So we'll joke outside. I got a table out there. We got plenty of time. Now, I don't want you to panic. I'm talking for longer than the other speakers, so I don't want you to think, oh my gosh, this guy's forgotten that it's 10 minutes per person. Well, thanks. That's kind of you. That's kind of you. These are the people who've never heard me before, obviously. All right, I actually live right over in Topeka, Kansas, so I was here at your state capitol, and then I was back in Topeka for an event, and now I'm back out here. This is the way I like it. I can sleep in my own bed. It's close enough. This is great. I don't always like flying to Denmark or whatever. I'm glad to be right here with you guys and talking about what we can do as people who live in this part of the country, and what can we do for the prosperity of our generation and generations to come. And what I'm talking about today is I'm giving kind of the big picture overview of everything, not super technical detailed, but a big picture overview. Because I think people who support a free market economy, capitalism, these words almost seem like things you have to apologize for, that you should be ashamed for believing in. And even I think some people who do believe in them do at times feel overcome by a sense of guilt. So they'll say, well, I favor the free market, but I understand it has problems and we got to regulate it and we got to, it's always some apologetic thing. Whereas I find the left does not apologize. I support socialism. They don't say, I support socialism, but, I know there have been mountains of corpses and I know this is an issue. And there's no corresponding sense of shame on their part. So I say if they can be proud of that record, we can be proud of ours. So these are not dirty words. You should embrace them. You should be dying for somebody to challenge you on this. And so what I want to do is talk about some things that maybe some of you know about, maybe you don't, but that might help you to maybe convey these ideas more effectively or to understand or appreciate the system that we have, or, well, I should say are supposed to have, so that we can communicate it better and win more converts to our cause. So I'm going to do this in two stages. The first stage is I'm going to describe to you the actual workings of a market economy and show you what it accomplishes, because it accomplishes things that frankly are miraculous, but we've grown so accustomed to them we don't even notice them anymore. We just assume this is just the way the world works, and we don't appreciate things. We become ungrateful for things. So I want us to have gratitude. I think ingratitude is one of the greatest sins in the world. So I want us to be grateful for what we've got. But then secondly, life is not all about order and efficiency. And it's not even indeed all about material things. But I do want to point out that one of the great, most common criticisms one will hear of a market economy is that it leaves the poor in the dust. Right? The rich do very well. They have their yachts, and they walk around with their sacks of money with dollar signs on them. But the poor person is just left to fend for himself, and isn't this terrible? So I want to spend some time talking about that issue too, showing that in fact there is no system that leads to a better outcome for everybody. All right, so let's start. First thing is, if you talk to somebody who is, let's say, if you were talking to a 19th century Marxist, he would say that one of the problems, just one of the problems with a market economy is that he would say there is an anarchy of production because there's no central planner barking out orders through a bullhorn at everybody. It's everybody on his own deciding, I'm going to start this business and I'm going to produce this type of widget, and you're going to produce that type of widget with your business, and you're going to hire this many people and locate your plant here or there. And a lot of us are going to produce the same good. Or a lot of us will produce goods that seem more or less interchangeable. You produce Coke, I produce Pepsi. And so the Marxist view would be that this is unnecessary duplication, this is chaotic, there's no order to it, and it would be far better to substitute for this disorder the order that comes from a guy barking out commands through a bullhorn, through a central planner. Now, superficially, that seems correct. It does seem that, wouldn't it be better if somebody just drew up a blueprint and then gave orders to people? All right, I've figured it out. We need 7 people to produce grain and 8 people to grow flowers or whatever, and then just assign people tasks. Wouldn't that be better if we had the capacity of one planner's mind and he could conceive of everything and then impose it on society? That would be much better. But what I'm going to show to you is that, to the contrary, it is the central planner and the central planning system of socialism. That's what's chaotic. And the market order, that on the surface appears to be an anarchy of production, is in fact the epitome of order and harmony. Now, how can I demonstrate that? Well, here's the first way. We've been taught that profit is a bad word, right? People before profits. Profits are wicked. Only an evil person wants to make profits. So, wonderful people and saints want to all make losses, apparently. It'd be better if we had an economy where everybody made losses, which is the implication of the anti-profit view. But what is profit actually doing? Profit is actually directing production. There are a million things we would all like to have. But there are finite resources in this world. We can't all have 10 yachts and 18 domestic servants and a dozen roses every day. And we can't all have all these things. So how do we take the unlimited desires we have for things? And you may say, well, but I'm more ascetic. I don't need all those things. That's true, but I bet if you had extra money, you'd donate it to charity. The point is, you can always find something to do with it. We have limited resources. We have unlimited wants. How do we regulate this? How do we decide, should we produce a gazillion oranges or just a billion oranges? What non-arbitrary way could we find to determine that? How could we settle a question like that? Profit directs production. In this way, I produce some widget and I earn a higher than normal profit. Well, what does this tell me? It tells me society likes my widgets. Society likes the decisions I made with my resources. I added value. I took raw materials and labor and land and I turned them into something people want. And I know they want it because I'm earning a profit. They're willingly giving me over and above what I paid for the stuff to make the widgets. So this is good. This means I should make more widgets. So I make more widgets. But other people realize I'm making a pile of dough in this widget business. So the profits that they know I'm making entice them to come into the widget production business. So now we have greater and greater number of people producing widgets, so the profits associated with widgets begin to fall, because now they've got to be shared by all of us. And so now the profits will fall to about a normal level, and now there is less incentive for other people to jump into the widget business. Now you've got to look for some other area of the economy that's underserved and start producing over there. Now suppose widgets start making losses. Suppose we move into the 20th century and we have somehow a 3D printer that can produce widgets in people's homes, and people don't need my widgets. There's much less demand for widgets, so now I start making losses. The losses obviously do not encourage people to enter the widget business. They encourage people to stay as far away from the widget business as possible. They encourage some firms to leave the widget business entirely. And so as that happens, the losses begin to dwindle and the normal profit level is restored. So the point is that the profit and loss feedback mechanism that we as consumers give to business firms directs them as to what to produce, so as to make sure that we don't have a great glut of something and a great underproduction of some other thing. This is how production is regulated without there needing to be a guy with a bullhorn. How would the guy with the bullhorn know exactly what 300 million people want? How could you know? There is no way. The only way to know is through this trial and error of producing things and seeing if you can turn a profit. If not, you've got to constantly go back and rethink what it is you're producing. Nobody can rest on his laurels in a market economy because the consumers are always demanding improvements or something different or more of something. You've got to be on your toes constantly. If your competitor has an innovation, if you don't want to be left behind, you better have that innovation. If there's a rental car office that has an automated car distribution system, you just push a button and you don't even have to talk to anybody, you get the car. If people like that, then you better have that improvement or you're going to lose. So everybody's got to be on his toes. This is one of the reasons that capitalists sometimes despise capitalism the most, because they don't like having to be on their toes. They want to just produce a good and just earn money. Just keep on earning money, producing the same old good over and over. And it's true, if you were in a crony capitalist system or a socialist system where there was no competition, you could get away with that. But in a market economy, there's always the opportunity for somebody else to pop in. So profit regulates production. But now, even more than this, here's the key thing. This is why socialism could not work. Now, people say the reason socialism can't work, and by socialism, by the way, I'm not talking about Sweden. I'm talking about the real live socialism as conceived of by Marx, where there is public ownership of the means of production, that you and I are not allowed to own our own private factories or capital goods or assembly line equipment or banks or any of that. We cannot own that privately. That is owned collectively or by the state. That was classic socialism. Now, the reason that's been given that why that can't work is that, well, there's no incentive for people to work because everybody gets the same pay, and so why would you bother working? That's an issue. But the central issue is actually something different. This was an issue that was touched upon in 1920 by Ludwig von Mises in an essay called Economic Calculation in the Socialist Commonwealth. This is an essay that if we really did live in a free society, all school children would read. As it turns out, none of them have ever heard of it. But it was in this essay that Mises showed why this can't possibly work. And what he showed is this. He said, what we have in a market economy is the ability to calculate profit and loss. Because a businessman can say, let's see, here were my inputs. I had 1 ton of bricks, 1 ton of lumber, and 1 ton of steel. And then I produced these consumer goods and I earned this much in revenue. Now let me compare my revenues with how much I spent on the steel and the lumber, etc., and see how I'm doing. Am I doing well or am I doing badly? Let me just do the arithmetic here and see how I'm doing. And then I will adjust my production decisions in the future. Maybe I need more of something else, less of another thing. Maybe I should locate my physical plant 2 miles down the road where the property values are less, but my transportation costs will be more. You can figure all this out because you have numbers to attach to these things. You can figure out, should I be located here or there? Should I use this production process that uses mostly rubber? Should I use this production process that uses mostly lumber? Well, if you didn't have any numbers, any dollar amounts to attach to those inputs, how would you evaluate whether, if they were both equally productive, should you use the lumber or the rubber? You'd have no way of knowing. But in a market economy, we have prices for all these inputs. Prices come about because you and I buy and sell things. That's where prices come about. Think of it as like a great auction. At an auction, the final bid is the high bid. High bid wins. There's one seller and a bunch of buyers. A market economy is like a bunch of sellers and a bunch of buyers. And prices settle at more or less an equilibrium point. These prices tell us things. They help us to calculate what would be the best way for me to produce widgets given these prices. If this particular input is very expensive, I'll try to find a way to produce widgets using another input. And the reason this particular input is expensive is because a lot of other production processes need this input and they are bidding for it. So it's through these various bids and the settling of prices that we ensure in a market economy that we produce the most highly valued things with the lowest valued inputs we can, so that we conserve and are good stewards of the limited resources we possess. It is the price system, freely arrived at, not with any dictator, nobody with a bullhorn, just the natural process of buying and selling gives rise to these prices, which allows entrepreneurs to calculate how they're doing. Are they producing profits or losses? And if they're making losses, can they figure out where are the losses coming from in my business? If I'm a baker, are the losses coming in my pastries or are they coming in my bread? And then they adjust their production processes accordingly. And this is how order comes about, because we can calculate profit and loss. Now, Mises said, suppose you had a socialist economy, however. In a socialist economy, there is no private ownership of the lumber, of the steel, of the assembly line equipment, of the factories, of all this stuff. This is all owned by the Central Planning Committee. And because it's all owned by one thing, there's no buying and selling. Nobody buys and sells. Like I wouldn't sell myself this tie. Like it would be nonsensical. It would be pointless. It would be a child's game because I own it already. Well, if the government owns all the inputs of production, they're not going to buy it. There's no buying and selling of it. And if there's no buying and selling, there are no prices. So therefore, the Central Planning Committee must make decisions for millions, tens of millions, hundreds of millions of people completely in the dark. They have no way of knowing which production process is the most efficient because they have no way of comparing lumber and rubber. Well, I mean, they're incommensurable. There's no third unit you can compare them with. So they have no way of knowing what to do, what to produce, where to produce it, how much to produce, using what process, using what inputs. They are completely in the dark. And the result is ludicrously and destructively uneconomic decision-making. In fact, the socialists basically had to cheat. What the commies basically did was they just looked on the world market and they looked at what were the capitalist countries paying for steel, and then they would sort of arbitrarily slap that onto their own steel prices because they had to have some way of figuring out relative scarcities and which is the best process to use. So they wouldn't dare actually have a whole world operating like this. I mean, there was an old joke about from the commies that they would in fact let one market society survive so they would know what to charge for everything. So you see, they recognize there's a problem here. You can't figure out what to do without this feedback mechanism in the form of prices. And so what you're going to have is complete chaos. You're going to have tractors, but you're not going to have anything to power them with. You're going to have a whole bunch of one thing and none of the complementary good that's necessary because you don't have this decentralized price mechanism that occurs spontaneously on the market. So the central planner produces chaos, and the market with no overall central plan produces order. It's contrary to what you would be led to expect. It seems counterintuitive, which is why so many people reflexively even today feel like, well, maybe if we had a central plan, it might, it didn't work in these other countries, but it does seem like it should work better. But it doesn't, it can't. And finally on this point, even when we look at the smallest, most modest little product, there are actually miracles contained in it. Now, some of you are familiar, I would assume, with an essay written many years ago called I, Pencil. And it's an essay written by a guy named Leonard Read, and he's writing it from the first-person point of view of a pencil. So it's like the pencil is writing the essay. And the pencil is telling you, basically, I am like the most interesting thing in the world. And you think, this is one uppity pencil, right? But he goes on to say that, look, he says, think about all that was necessary to make me possible. I'm a modest little pencil. But he says, first of all, what's the pencil made out of primarily? Wood. But the pencil is trying to convey to you is that nobody in this room knows how to make a pencil. Nobody in the world knows how to make a pencil. Now you think now the pencil is being way too ambitious with that claim. But because you think to yourself, well, my friend Fred works at a pencil factory. I'm sure he could make a pencil. But think about it. The whole process of making a pencil, no one could possibly know. Pencil's made out of wood. How are you going to get that wood? You got to chop down a tree. If you're going to chop down a tree, you need an axe or a saw, which means you're going to need steel, which means you're going to need to get iron ore. You're going to need to know all about that. You need to know about mining. And then not only that, but you also need the rubber for the eraser, which is a whole other production process. You need trucks to transport the wood and the rubber. The trucks require gasoline. They need rubber for the tires and all these other things. There's the graphite, which comes from South America. And then there's a little metal thing at the top. I mean, there's all this stuff. Then there's paint. That has a million production processes associated with that. And when you consider it all, there is no one brain that could have the technical knowledge to pull off the production of a pencil. So you would think, if you just heard, somebody described all those steps, and believe me, I haven't even touched the tip of the iceberg with the pencil production. Somebody described that to you, you would think there's no way we could make such a miracle item. Right? This would just have to come from, Martians would have to bring this thing to us. There's no way we could do this. And especially if we did do it, though, then darn it, for all your free market propaganda, we would need a pencil commissar in charge, directing the production around the world, making sure that everything's produced in the right quantities at the right time with no surpluses or shortages, just enough to produce pencils. Surely we would need that. And yet, look around you, right? There are more pencils than you know what to do with. Like you see a pencil on the street, you throw it in the garbage. Like it doesn't even mean anything to you. You don't stand there and say, oh, miracle of creation, I can't believe. But when you think about it, it really is something else. That this happens, and it happens all the time, and nobody even notices it. That's why economics is interesting. Because a lot of people think economics is boring. It's a lot of facts and figures. Well, that's if you have a bad professor. But honest to goodness, the fact that something like that can occur, and economics shows you how it can occur. How is that possible? That all these people's plans come together in just the right way to make this little product. If that interests you, then economics should interest you. All right, so that's why we should, first of all, be proud to support what we support, because the system that we support produces this sort of miraculous outcome. But then there's the other side of things that I want to look at, and that is the prosperity angle. Okay, maybe it produces pencils really well, but maybe we're all poor. Like maybe a pencil is like all we have. Like we have to also look at what are the outcomes in terms of prosperity, income, poverty, wealth. And here, I think the market also succeeds dramatically. Here we have prosperity for all. And I'm going to show you how that happens in a minute, but first I want to persuade you that indeed it has happened. When we look at the Economic Freedom of the World Index, and these sorts of indexes are produced annually by various organizations, and they look at different countries in the world, and they evaluate them according to how free they are economically. And what do you know? The freest economies also tend to be the wealthiest. But and by free, I just mean there are no constraints, or not no, but there are fewer constraints on the ability of human beings to make purchases, make sales, and open businesses and things like that. But what's interesting is when you look at the poor in those countries, the poor also enjoy the greatest material wealth and the fewest deprivations in the economies that are the freest. Well, that's a pretty big piece of empirical evidence for our side. But we also have the 20th century and indeed the 19th century as well to count for us. So I have noted a number of times that when you look at the statistics regarding absolute poverty, which is a measure economists use for people who are living just in grinding, unspeakable poverty. In the year 1820, that was about 80% of the world lived like that. By 1950, it was down to 50%. By the early 90s, it was in about 33%. And then by the early 2000s, it was down to just under 20%. Now, that's quite something. In fact, there has been more progress against poverty around the world in the past 50 years than there had been in the previous 500. In the years from the early 80s to the early 2000s, we had, for the first time in any 20-year period in history, both the percentage and the absolute number of impoverished people fall. Now, you'll notice we didn't read a whole lot about that in the New York Times. I mean, this is a historic achievement. You would think, I don't know, like one headline, something, nothing. I leave it to your imagination, or I leave it as an exercise for the student as to why it would be that this sort of news, you would have to wait to this event here in 2013 to find out about it. Now, in a minute, I'll get into why did that happen. Maybe it's just a coincidence. I go, why did that happen? But I want to also touch on something we hear a lot about, inequality, right? Well, you get a lot of inequality in a free market society. You get super rich people and super poor people. Okay, well, it's true, but some of that inequality comes from the fact that the rich people tend to have political connections, and so that doesn't really count, because that's not the free market's fault, that's the government's fault. But let's also consider this. When we look over the course of past 1,000 years of history, we see an awful lot of inequality basically everywhere we look. If you look at communist societies, you mean they did away with inequality in the Soviet Union? No, in fact, there was a new kind of inequality. If you were part of the bureaucracy, you got the best medical care, or you got medical care at all. If you got all these sorts of things, if you had political connections. So they didn't do away with inequality. As a matter of fact, I have a friend who used to live in the Soviet Union who told me that, he said, the story has never really been told what it was like living there. It's never really been told the full story, what a day in the life was like. He said, for example, suppose your toilet got backed up. Now here, you call a plumber, it's fixed. There weren't enough plumbers because the Central Planning Board decided on the number of plumbers, and there were never enough. And the plumbers knew it. And so if we were even going to get the plumber in the door within 3 months, this is not a joke, we had to have the biggest feast laid out on our table that our family had ever prepared. That would be to get him in the door, and maybe he'd repair our toilet. He said, now, that's just one indignity that you had to endure. Now multiply that by every aspect of life, and you have the beginning of what it was like to live there. Forget about all the spiritual deprivation and everything else, just the simple thing like a toilet. So there's been inequality everywhere. But the real issue is, first of all, how are the poor actually doing? If I have 10 yachts and the poorest person has only 1 yacht, I don't think there's real grounds for complaint. Now, I'm not making light of the plight of people who are materially deprived today. I don't want to make light of that, but we do have to put things into perspective. Mises was fond of saying this. He said, in the old days, the rich traveled in a coach and four, a coach driven by 4 horses, whereas the poor had to walk around on foot, often with just terrible shoes or no shoes. Today, the difference is the rich guy drives a super fancy car and the poor guy drives a beat-up Chevy. So yeah, sure, there's a difference. There's big inequality there. But there's obviously far, far less of a difference between a fancy car and a lousy car than there was between a coach and 4 and walking on foot. Moreover, we all enjoy amenities that even the Habsburgs couldn't have imagined. You know, at their summer home, they didn't even have flush toilets. This was the most famous name in European history. Didn't have, and then we just sort of take this for granted, like, well, of course, everybody's going to have this. Everybody's going to have, I mean, when you look, one of my favorite old shows is The Honeymooners. Now, Ralph Cramden was a cheapskate. I'll grant you that. But the point is, it was conceivable that at that time you could have no refrigerator, no telephone, no radio, and no TV. That was considered at least possible. Like, they weren't considered complete oddballs and outcasts from society. Now, everybody has these things, and they still feel like, I haven't been given enough stuff. I need more. Somebody give me some more stuff. You know, again, there is not the pause to recognize we should be thankful for this, that the worst kind of poverty, like the kind that Americans couldn't even begin to conceive of, has more or less been indeed eliminated. Then around the world, you look at the poorest countries. From the 60s to today, their caloric intake has increased by 1/3. Their life expectancy as compared to the richer countries has gone up from 60% of that life expectancy to 80% of that life expectancy, and so on. We've seen in late 19th century England, the difference between the rich and the poor in terms of life expectancy was 17 years. Today it's 2 years. It used to be, between the rich and the poor, there was a difference of 5 inches in height. Now it's less than 1 inch. In the United States throughout the 20th century, the real incomes of people in the bottom quintile, that is the people in the lowest 20% income distribution, have seen their real incomes increase by 1,900%. Well, that's not a record to be ashamed of, or to run away from, or to be embarrassed by. Now, my remarks would not be complete if I did not say something about money. We're talking about sound money at this event, in part. So let's see how money fits into this. Again, I want to proceed on money the way I did with the subject of the market as a whole. Order and efficiency, and prosperity. But this time I'm going to go out of order. I'm going to deal with prosperity first. When we talk about sound money, we're talking about money that governments can't manipulate. And man, they try. You know, with whatever you give them, they'll try. But with gold or silver or one of these precious metals, the problem is they can't make photocopies of it. They can't print up a whole lot of it. And that's why they hate it, because it constrains their ability to spend, and it constrains their ability to siphon off resources from the rest of us. Because think if you were a counterfeiter, and you just printed up money that looked like real US dollars, and you started spending it, you would be just taking stuff from everybody else without contributing anything. The normal way you get money is you contribute something, you get paid for contributing it, and then you go out and buy something. So you gave society something, then you take something. But if you're a counterfeiter, all you do is produce the money out of nothing. You didn't get that money because you provided a service to society or produced some goods. You just created the money out of nothing. Then when you go to spend that, you're just grabbing. So when you earn money honestly, you earned it because you gave and then you grab. But the counterfeiter just grabs. And that's what governments want to do when they create money out of thin air. They create paper money. That's a way that they can spend without having to produce anything and without having to tax us noticeably, thinking that we'll be too thick to realize what's happening. And unfortunately, they've been right a lot of the time. People haven't realized what's been happening. But this, make no mistake, this is the reason that fashionable opinion is appalled at the idea that you might have a gold standard or some kind of precious metal backing for the currency. It is not because this is bad for the economy or all the phony baloney excuses they give. It's because this means less power for the government and less power for its favored constituencies. That is the reason. There is no other reason. That is why they are opposed to it. And that is why Mises said that sound money belongs up there on the list of guarantees of liberty, up there with written constitutions and bills of rights. The very fact that fashionable opinion and the political class are opposed to sound money is almost everything you need to know about the importance of sound money. I've sometimes said that the next best thing after being right all the time is being wrong all the time. Because I can pretty much lead a very good life, intellectually and morally, by doing the exact opposite of everything Barack Obama recommends, right? So what has the record of sound money actually been in history? Well, as I said at the state capitol earlier this week, let's see, what has the record been like? I mean, I guess we'll have to look back and maybe it's been, a little bit of this, a little bit of that. Well, it turns out that actually it's been pretty darn good. That in England, when England was on the gold standard into the 19th century, England had basically the greatest period of economic progress in the history of the world. Now, we're told that sound money would cause a depression and da-da-da-da. Well, who are you going to believe? These whining complainers who just want to grab more of your dough or your own eyes? Because England survived quite well with sound money. The United States had, again, some of the greatest economic progress in the history of the world during the period of the classical gold standard. So if you're looking at in through the 1820s, down through the Civil War, and then from the 1870s up through the eve of World War I, absolutely astonishing economic growth and progress, increase in incomes dramatic for all classes, wage rates, real wage rates rising, like everything you could ask for, prices falling. Today, the geniuses tell us that if prices fall, this is terrible and it leads to a depression. Prices fell all through the 19th century, and it just made Americans richer because they could get more stuff with their dough. And now, let's see, how am I doing on time? All right, I think I'm going to go right up to, I'm going to take a few minutes digression to point out, by the way, how it is that we got to the point where if you lived in, let's say, 1800, you'd be much poorer than you are now. And it is worth pausing to note how that happened, because we're told that you need inflation of the money supply, or otherwise there's going to be a depression. And yet, we saw this huge increase in standard of living without inflation. So apparently inflation is not a necessary ingredient. So then what is the ingredient? And basically, here's the quick answer. If you think back to, let's say, the year 1720, and you look at the way people are living, they're living hand to mouth, basically. One bad harvest, and they could be on the verge of starvation. This is not an enviable position to be in. They don't have modern dentistry also. I mean, this would be horrifying in some ways. So how did we get from there to here? And the answer is, it because the government developed welfare programs, or the government created a lot of money out of thin air and could buy us a lot of things with it? The answer basically is this. I give this thought experiment. I say, let's suppose we have our economy today, 2013, and suppose when all of us are sleeping, some Martians come and they take all our factories and they take all our production and assembly line equipment and all our communications technology and all our transportation technology. And all we're left with is riding on horseback, and they're going to be sports about it. They're going to let us use the telegraph. And that's what we've got. Now, suppose in that primitive economy you went back to your job, if your job still existed. If you were making plasma TVs, you're unemployed now. There's no way to make plasma TVs with just horseback and a telegraph and your bare hands. So that's not going to happen. But suppose you still had your job and you said, well, time to go to my 9-to-5 job, 40 hours a week. 40 hours a week with no machinery to help you, you would produce like a pittance of what you used to produce. Society wouldn't be able to survive. There wouldn't be enough goods to keep people alive. you would have to work 80 hours a week or 100 hours a week just barely to get by. Now, that would not be because the wicked capitalists are forcing these long hours on you. It would be because the economy is so primitive that unless you work a backbreaking schedule, not enough stuff will be produced to keep the population alive. That's the reason. But yet when you go back and look at your textbook or you remember what your 7th grade teacher told you, the implication was the reason people were poor in 1720 or 1820 was that the rich people had all the stuff and they were selfishly refusing to distribute it to everybody. The problem with that is, if 1 out of every 1,000 people is a rich capitalist, it doesn't matter if, okay, so that person probably eats twice the food, fancier food, has 10 times as much furniture as the average person. Okay, so you divide his 10 times as much furniture by 1,000, and you start distributing a portion of it to everybody. Like, okay, you get 1 table leg now that we took from the rich guy, and you get 1 mouthful of his rice or whatever. This would have 0 impact on anybody except the rich guy who would probably move away after you did that. So the idea that, well, that was what was standing in the way. We didn't have enough government to redistribute things. No, to the contrary, it had nothing whatsoever to do with government. It had to do with the fact that business firms take their profits and they buy machines with it so that with your bare hands you can produce a whole lot more. My father was a forklift operator. If he didn't have a forklift, how much could he possibly aspire to get paid to stack pallets when he can't even reach some of these? Forget about the weight. He can't even reach some of these heights. So they buy forklifts to make him more productive. And this allows more goods to be produced. More goods are produced with about the same amount of money in the economy. Each unit of money becomes more valuable and can fetch more goods. And that's how our standard of living increased. It has nothing whatsoever to do with government or inflating the money supply or anything like that. And we still see this in the tech industry. We see laptops always seem to go down in price. Well, imagine an economy where that was true of everything. And that was what you had under a sound money, free market economy. The Federal Reserve System was created 100 years ago this year. It was the Federal Reserve Act was passed in December, if I get a boo. It was passed in December of 1913. It opened its doors early the following year. And the Federal Reserve System was an inflationary system. Initially, there was a gold aspect to it, but it did encourage creating more money than there was gold backing it up. And then by 1933, there wasn't any more gold backing it up except for international transactions. And then in 1971, that was taken away. And now the government can, with the Fed's help, get itself out of fiscal jams in various ways. But we're told that, well, the Fed, though, has given us more stability. Now, they say this after the biggest financial bubble in the history of the world just burst, but they call this stability in this Orwellian world. But it turns out, I've actually done work on this, it turns out that to the contrary, the Fed, contrary to what we think, has not given us fewer or shallower recessions than we used to have. And if you're interested in this subject, because you will have people saying to you, before we had the Fed, we had ups and downs, how can you blame that on the Fed? Ho, 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 they'll say to you. I have a page on my website dedicated to this, tomwoods.com/panics. Tomwoods.com/panics has a talk by me on this subject specifically and some links if you want more on that. And I'll note also, by the way, a lot of people follow my videos and stuff and follow me on Facebook and Twitter, and I appreciate that. And none of them know that I blog every day. I blog like 3 to 7 times every weekday. So visit me at tomwoods.com for that, please. Okay, so we don't need to go into that. I'll just say I've got the data there if you want to examine it. So the Fed's record is not so good, and also, of course, what has it done to the dollar? The dollar is now worth about 4 cents as compared to what it was when the Fed got started. So 96% of its value has been drained from it. And as I said this earlier this week, what the Fed supporters will say is, well, that's okay because the dollar lost its value very slowly under the Fed. So you really shouldn't, I'm not making that up, you shouldn't really hold that against them. This happened very gradually. Now, could you imagine if it were the other way around, that under a gold standard, the dollar lost its value gradually? Do you think they'd let us get away with, oh, well, look, that happened only gradually? No, they'd be pounding this over our heads, right? So they can't lose no matter what happens. They've stacked the deck. So what that means, that our dollar has lost value, is this, that before you had the current system, when you had gold coins or silver coins circulating as money, not the role they have now where they're kind of like an inflation hedge and People often don't use them in monetary transactions. But back when that was what you used, you could save for your old age by accumulating these coins because they held their value. You can look at the statistics. If you bought a men's suit in 1800, it would be about the same price in 1900. In fact, it would be a little cheaper in 1900. So it would hold its value. Today, only a lunatic would say, well, I've got to save for my old age, so I'm going to stack up these green pieces of paper printed by the Federal Reserve, and by the time I retire, these are going to be worth a pretty penny. Well, they'll be worth closer to a penny than you realize. So no one would do that because they're going to lose at least a third of their value, if not more. So what does that mean the average person is now forced to do? The average person, just to break even, now feels like, I got to go into the stock market. I got to buy stocks. I got to buy bonds. I got to speculate. Most of us don't belong in the stock market doing that. But people are doing this just to break even because this system, which is supposed to be the system of the people, we can't crucify mankind upon a cross of gold. No, let's crucify them on a papier-mâché cross? Like, how is that better? And in fact, now, what are they going to do for their old age? Now they're going to become speculative. And if you were in the S&P 500, that still hasn't gained back where it was in 2000. That's the system that's supposed to be for the common man. If you really shouldn't believe that. I'll just say that. This system does benefit somebody, but it obviously is not the average person who has to scramble to figure out ways to provide for old age. Okay, and then my last point about money would be order. How does a free market in money provide order? The same way that the market in general provides order, by regulating production by profit and making sure that we get things produced in the way that is least costly in terms of foregone opportunities. How about money? Well, exactly how a completely free market in money would work is beyond my scope today, but I have a page for that, tomwoods.com/money, if you want to learn about that. I make these pages so that I can not seem like I'm copping out. Like I say, look, I really have talked about this, and now you can go look at it. But here's the basic gist of how it works. If you have a free market, if you treat banking like it were any other business, no special privileges, no bailouts, just a regular business like any other business, the way it works basically is like this. The bank stores your money for safekeeping. The bank can be used as an institution that you write checks with, so it sounds kind of like a bank today. But the interest rates that you would see would be meaningful. That is to say, what money and interest rates help to do is to coordinate production over time. And what I mean by that is the price system helps us to figure out what goods we should produce. Because you can figure out, well, I'd make more profit if I produced widgets as opposed to popsicles or something. You figure that out by thinking in terms of the price system. But it's not just what product should I produce, it's how long-term of a project should I take on? Should I invest in a project that's going to take 3 years before it'll turn a profit, or 4 years before it's completed, or whatever? These things also have to be decided. Because if I'm going to work on a really long-term project, I need to borrow resources to sustain myself during that project. And if people in society aren't ready to lend me those resources, then I can't sustain my project and I shouldn't begin it. And interest rates basically regulate this. When interest rates are low, entrepreneurs will say, okay, now's the time for us to invest in our long-term project because we can get cheap financing. Why do they get cheap financing? Because there are a lot of funds available that people have saved. And those resources allow the completion of these long-term projects. But when you get a Federal Reserve involved that has a monopoly on the money supply and has government privileges, it lowers interest rates artificially, which misleads entrepreneurs into thinking, now's the time to invest in my long-term project. All these resources are available. But they're really not. This is a false signal. This is white noise that's interfering with their ability to make sound, orderly economic decisions, and this is where you get the boom and bust. When you have a free market in money and a free market with interest rates, you get economic progress. When you have the system we have now, you have some progress mixed in with a fake boom, and then this leads to a crash, and then some progress, and then a crash. And you get this cyclical pattern. Karl Marx said the cyclical pattern is because capitalism is stupid, and it's got contradictions built into it. And there are people, even free marketers, who believe, well, you got to take the good with the bad with the free market. That's not true. And in fact, that's what the Austrian free market economists have shown, is that this part of the economy that it goes up and down, that is not a natural feature of a market economy. There's no reason that that should happen. It is caused by the systemic intervention into the most important market of all, the money market. Money is half of every transaction. If you are meddling with that, interfering with that, that's a system-wide interference. You're going to have a system-wide consequence. If you're interested in that, I have a page for you too. LearnAustrianEconomics.com. Austrian economics, of course, is not the economics of Austria. I have no interest in the economics of Austria. This is a school of thought that had basically warned that this was going to happen, and, well, we just kept on doing it. And I don't mean we. By we, I mean the Federal Reserve. I certainly don't mean we. Okay, I was going to conclude, I think I'll conclude just without this, but I was going to conclude with the what about Sweden objection. You do get that once in a while, so I'll give you the 60-second rebuttal to that. Once in a while you'll get, okay, I understand we shouldn't have gulag socialism, where people are being killed by the tens of millions. I'll grant you that. But why can't we have Swedish socialism? Like the Swedes seem to be doing okay, right? I mean, they've got a huge welfare state, and they spend a whole lot of money, and they're doing okay. What's the matter with you, you Neanderthal? Like, you will get that objection. So the quick answer is, basically, Sweden could only afford that welfare state because they had a free market. In the late 19th century into the 20th century, they avoided war, and they became a wealthy country. And then they started blowing all this dough on all this government spending. But as late as 1950, Sweden's government spending was only about 21% of GDP, which is not outrageously large compared to other countries. But it was the 60s and 70s where the government really, really grew dramatically in Sweden, and that's where they began to lose their international competitiveness. They went from being the fourth wealthiest country in terms of GDP per capita of the industrialized countries to the early 90s being down to number 14. Entrepreneurship was totally snuffed out. If you look at the 100 firms with the highest revenues in Sweden in 2004, you know how many of them had been started since 1970? 2. So, I mean, complete devastation. They did have a lot of equality, but they had that before the welfare state. And they also had a lot of cultural traditions, hard work, which you see replicated everywhere the Swedes go in the world. They replicate these habits, high levels of trust. And when you don't have these, well, the welfare state spending becomes much more devastating. But the past 20 years, the trend has been toward market reforms and lower taxes in Sweden. And moreover, the Scandinavian countries also tend not to have as much regulation of the economy. So they can enjoy the benefits of a free market and then spend a lot of the money on some of these government programs. So it's not true that this is some kind of sustainable third way. So here's the choice that faces you here as Missouri moves forward. I mean, there are models in the world that you can look to. You could look to France. You could be like France, where they say, we'll just impose a 35-hour week on everybody, and that'll spread around more work. And yet the story of France for the past 40 years has been unemployment. The story of Europe, with a few exceptions, has been, for the past 40 years, unemployment, even though they have had everything that the interventionists into the economy could have asked for. They've had the deficits, they've had the spending, they've done it all. All these things that are supposed to cure unemployment haven't done it. For 4 years or more, we've had unbelievable deficits. These are supposed to cure unemployment. And we see stagnation, and we may be getting worse again. They don't know what they're doing. You could follow those people, and you would be treated, welcomed, feted with open arms by the New York Times and all fashionable opinion. However, if you don't hate mankind, you might follow a different model, which is the one I'm describing to you now, which is the crazy idea that human beings are not owned by other people, that ought to be able to be free to enter into their own transactions with one another, and enjoy the fruits or suffer the consequences of those decisions, and live in a society where people have enough civic virtue that they have the good and spontaneous sense to help one another when they're in need, and not simply to brush them off and send them to some government bureaucracy. That's not impossible. That can be achieved. But although there are political ways of going about this, my specialty is education. So what I would urge you to do is learn this stuff so that you understand it as well as you can, so you can spread it to your kids. It was my father talking to me about this stuff. I'm sure I would have been a socialist if it hadn't been for him. That's not a joke. If it hadn't been for him, I would have been a socialist. But he persuaded me of this stuff. So you have huge influence over certain people. So I have a website, libertyclassroom.com, which I urge you to take a look at. I have coupons for it out on my table. Coupons are good. Coupons save you money. I want you to take one. So check out libertyclassroom.com. I'm also working on a comprehensive K through 12 homeschool curriculum across all subjects, math, science, and the social sciences. Because to me, I can hardly think of anything that would have a greater long-term impact than educating children in the principles that we know to be true, that we believe in, instead of having to fight and fight and fight constantly with teachers and school boards and textbooks, but showing them this stuff from the beginning and having an educated public educated in these ideas that basically Ron Paul has helped to bring to a much larger public than ever saw them before. If you're interested, if this interests you, then hop onto my list. I have an e-letter I send out every month. I don't sell it. I don't advertise. I don't take ads for it or anything like that. I'm not making money off my email list. It's just to keep people up to date on things. No. In fact, I lose money on the email letter because I give away books every month to people, in a book giveaway. In fact, I have one person here, I think, at this event won a book for me. There she is right there. So that I didn't make this up. I really do give books away to people on my list. But I will be keeping people updated on the progress of this curriculum. We should have a little something up by the end of the spring, but definitely we're going to do 1 year at a time, get the thing going. The first 4, 5 years, 6 years of the program will be free. You won't have to pay 1 cent to be part of it. And so just sign up for my letter, woodsletter.com, and I have talked way too much, and I appreciate your patience. Thank you.